In this module, we'll be doing the installation and basic configuration of the Cisco IM and Presence server. First, before we get started, let's go through a module overview and talk about some of the prerequisite tasks that you'll need to understand, one in particular, but I'll get to that here in the next slide. In this module, we're going to talk about the prerequisite that I hinted to a moment ago, and this is going to be modification of the Cisco Unified Communications Manager server definitions to use fully qualified domain names. And I'll get into that in the next slide, so let's just jump over that for the time being here. We're going to perform an IM and Presence installation, starting with the operating system and walking you through the configuration wizard to the point of bringing up the web GUI. We're then going to go in and configure the SIP publish trunk, or the IM and Presence publish trunk, on the Unified Communications Manager that will be necessary to facilitate presence status information and exchange of presence status between the CUCM and IM and Presence server. Finally, we're going to configure basic IM&P server parameters that will get you up and running with as minimum configuration steps and back and forth as possible. So the idea, and really this is a lot of the meat of the course and what I was hoping for when designing this course, was to walk you through as close to turnkey as I can make it anyway, approach so that you can fire up the server, enter some key parameters, and walk away with an operational deployment following typical deployment guidelines. First and foremost, you need to start by breaking some traditional best practices. And the best practice I'm referring to is probably the first thing you learned when you walked into the first Unified Communications Manager training course you ever attended. They would preach and preach and preach, we want to remove DNS dependence from the system. So what we would do is we would go into the server configuration, we would see the host name of the server listed, and we would delete it, and we would replace it with the IP address. So we no longer require DNS in order to register phones, etc. Now, there were some other places you'd change those parameters as well, but you get the point. It was all about removing DNS dependence. Well, times are changing, best practices are changing, and now we need to be leveraging fully qualified domain names, or FQDN-based environments, to support things like Presence and Jabber for Windows, because we're using certificates heavily, and you're going to run into issues if you're not fully qualified domain name based. So take it from me right now, change those best practices and adopt this new approach. Now let's jump into some of the actual configuration. Let's do this DNS dependence removal and changing to FQDN and Call Manager, and then walk through some of the Presence configuration tasks. If you've ever been to a training class and learned how to install and configure Cisco Unified Communications Manager, you'll probably recall a conversation around DNS dependence. Traditional best practices were such so that CUCM servers were configured to communicate with an IP address rather than a host name. Usage of certificates in Jabber for Windows have all but changed that best practice, and we now live in a fully qualified domain name type of environment. So it will likely be necessary for you to configure your Unified Communications Manager and your other services, such as Unity Connection, etc., to utilize FQDN, where they likely are using a host name or IP address today. To change the CUCM from using a host name or IP-based address to using a fully qualified domain name is a fairly straightforward process, and I'll demonstrate it now. Log into the Unified Communications Manager administrative interface and go to the top of the page and click System. We'll navigate to the option for Server and select it. A list of servers will be displayed, and in this example we'll see one called CUCM Pub. If I open that server and look at its existing configuration, you'll see that this is host name based. Your environment may be either host name or IP address. Either way, we will need to make a modification so that this is now in a fully qualified domain name format. In our example, that will be cucmpub.cisco.lab. I'm going to go ahead and enter a description for our CUCM publisher, just for my own convenience, and I'll click Save. We will be given an on-screen message that reminds us to update our DNS server with the appropriate records reflected in the hostname change. I'll click OK to close this message dialog. Now that we've configured the CUCM server to utilize the fully qualified domain name value, we also need to add an entry for the IAM and presence server that we will be installing here in just a little while. In previous versions of Unified Communications Manager, the presence cluster was truly that, a cluster of its own. There was a publisher and there was a subscriber. However, in newer versions of CUCM, the Call Manager Publisher is actually the publisher for the entire cluster, and the presence server is simply another subscriber. So I'll click Add New in the server configuration page to define a new presence server. To do that, under Server Type, I'll select CUCM, IAM, and Presence, and then click the Next button. You'll see that Server Type has been identified as CUCM, IAM, and Presence, and we have an option here for fully qualified domain name /IP address. You may have seen previous documentation or forum threads where it was recommended to issue your certificates with an IP address so that we could continue to honor the old format of using server references based on IP. However, many certificate providers will not allow you to create certificates, so we're going to continue and follow the fully qualified domain name strategy for defining this server. Our IAM and Presence server is named imp01.cisco.lab. You'll also be required to configure the IAM and Presence domain, and if you'll think back to some of the earlier slides when we talked about the Jabber ID and how the Jabber ID was composed of the user ID at presence domain, this is where that presence domain gets configured. In our example, it will be cisco.lab. I'll configure a description for the CUCM, IAM, and Presence server, and I will click the Save button. At this point, we've completed the prerequisite server configuration, and I want to show you something. Down at the bottom, it says Presence Redundancy Group, Default CUP Subcluster. The Presence Redundancy Group didn't previously exist until we created a presence server. And in fact, if you want to see the details of the Presence Redundancy Group, click System and go to Presence Redundancy Groups. You'll see a list of Presence Redundancy Groups, and I'll go ahead and I'll click on the one that was here just a moment ago, freshly created, Default CUP Subcluster. And you'll see some of the legacy names of Cisco Unified Presence coming into play with the phrase CUP. So we have a primary and secondary presence server that can be configured in a presence redundancy group. You can have no more than 2 presence servers in a presence redundancy group, and it is recommended to deploy presence servers in a parallel fashion so that you do have presence server redundancy and, beyond just redundancy, also load balancing. No changes are required here. However, if you are going to stand up a secondary presence server, you would have created a second presence server definition and made sure that it was populated in the presence redundancy group. But since we're not going to be configuring redundancy in the presence cluster as part of this exercise, we'll leave that configuration the way it is, and we can simply go back to the list or close out of the Call Manager administration completely, because we're ready to begin the process of installing the IAM and Presence operating system virtual machine.